and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our design funding webinar hosted by Convergence on how to apply for our design funding windows and any questions you might have about that. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping rules that you may all be familiar with through the many webinars we have all attended. Please stay on mute for the duration of the webinar. If you have questions, you can raise your hand and we will have an extended Q&A session at the end and ask you to speak up. You can also use the chat box throughout the webinar to post your questions and we will respond as we go along. We would also ask that you rename yourself with the name of your organization. As for example, you can see my name is Aditi Gupta at /Convergence on Zoom. And with that, let me get started. Another note on housekeeping is that we will be recording this webinar. However, we will not be recording the Q&A session. That is only for internal purposes and Chatham House rules apply. So please do feel free to ask any questions that you have and those will not be shared. So with that, let me introduce myself. I'm Aditi Gupta and I lead the Market Acceleration and Design Funding team at Convergence. On the webinar today, you have other Convergence team members, Adi Vishisht, Alejandro Diaz, and Matthias Priest. The agenda for the webinar today is going to be focused on our design funding windows. We'll start with an overview of convergence and blended finance for those of whom may not be as familiar. Then we will give a brief presentation on the application process for our design funding windows and then go into Q&A with two of our grantees, Allotro Partners and Blue Finance, who we are very fortunate to have with us today. And we will be leaving 20 minutes at the end for open Q&A and discussion. With that, we can move to the next slide. So what is Convergence? For those of you who may not know us, Convergence is the global network for blended finance, and we focus only on emerging markets. We generate blended finance data, intelligence, and deal flow to increase private sector investment in emerging markets. We are a global network and have a membership base of over 200 members. And for these members, we have a deal matchmaking platform. We also have the largest historical deals database on blended finance transactions in emerging markets. And the last bullet you see here is market acceleration and design funding, which is the focus of our webinar today. Through this vertical, we provide pre-investment capital in the form of grants for designing blended finance structures. And currently we have two open funding windows, both in Asia. The first is the IndoPacific window, targeting gender equality and sustainable and resilient infrastructure. And the second is the Asia Natural Capital window. Alejandro will be speaking about both of these windows in more detail. Before I turn to Alejandro, I'm going to take a minute to define blended finance. Blended finance is the strategic use of catalytic capital, which is capital not seeking market rate returns from public or philanthropic sources to increase a private sector investment in emerging markets. We see that all blended finance transactions should have three important components. First, there must be a financial return. That is how private sector investors will get attracted to the transaction in the first place. Second, there must be impact, and all blended finance transactions should be SDG aligned. But importantly, not every participant in the transaction needs to have an impact objective. You could have a transaction where the catalytic capital provider has an impact objective, but the commercial capital provider may simply be looking to make the return if the transaction fits the risk return profile. And lastly, there must be leverage, which is that the catalytic capital being provided by the public or philanthropic parties is being used such that a deal is happening that would otherwise have not happened or would have attracted very little private sector investment. With that, I will turn it over to Alejandro. And if you have other questions on blended finance, our website has a lot of resources, including a primer on blended finance. So I would encourage you to look at that. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat box for us.
Thank you so much, Aditi. My name is Alejandro Diaz. I'm a senior associate in the design funding team. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. Before jumping in, we will begin, as Aditi mentioned, with the introduction to design funding. We will then discuss, what is eligible, who can apply, what kind of activities are funded, and then we'll move to our process, and subsequently a little bit of our existing windows again, and we will then turn to our moderated session with our grantees, Allotrope Partners and Blue Finance. When we are going through this, if you do have any questions throughout, please feel free to jump in the chat functionality. Ask your questions throughout. We will be monitoring that chat and answering questions as we can. And if not, we'll also be answering those questions during the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So I'll jump in here. So what is design funding? So our design funding program awards grants to accelerate the development and launch of catalytic blended finance solutions. These blended finance solutions, investment vehicles, investment opportunities, can be projects, companies, facilities, funds, bonds, notes, any kind of investment opportunity that aims to attract private sector capital into these sectors that are being targeted. Any and all types of organizations can apply. You can be an NGO, you can be an asset manager, an advisory firm, a corporate, a DFI. We don't have a restriction on who can apply. This is open to all practitioners who may be designing, working on a new investment opportunity that they would like to bring to market. The idea of design funding really is to encourage the launch of new vehicles. So as we know and have communicated, you may be already in touch with Convergence, we know that blended finance transactions can be complex. They can take some time to launch and they can be costly. So this funding is meant to encourage organizations, practitioners such as yourselves, to go through the process and have this support available. We fund two types of activities: feasibility study activities and proof of concept activities. For feasibility study, and some of this overlaps with proof of concept, of course, but we're funding the structuring work, the market scoping, pipeline building, fundraising, engagement with stakeholders, prospective investors and funders. And in terms of outcomes, sticking to the feasibility study side, look at a final outcome as being, securing an initial commitment that would be putting you in the right direction towards that end goal, which is launching this investment opportunity in this investment vehicle. For proof of concept activities, similarly, what we are funding is pipeline building, fundraising, final structuring, legal work that needs to happen, finalizing documentation to launch a vehicle. In this particular case, we are looking at proof of concept proposals to be more advanced, have an initial concept and structure that needs to be maybe tweaked to get to launch and to reach that final close, and supporting throughout. And so in this particular case for proof of concept, just on eligibility, applicants must have an initial financial model and at least some interest from investors or funders in place prior to the application or currently prior to submission of a proposal. The period that we look at is around 6 to 18 months. And of course, that would be dependent on each of your own initiatives and what must happen, what your work plan looks like. What design funding is not, we are not providing funding that is investment capital. So we are not funding an existing, a tranche of an existing blended finance vehicle. We are not funding operational activities, operational work of existing vehicles either. This is for new vehicles that are in the process of being designed and launched. We're also not providing funding for technical work. So we're not providing funding for engineering work, for technical studies, for exploring a new technique on, let's say, a forestry technique. It is not project preparation work. It's, again, design funding going back to the blended finance elements, structuring, the pipeline building, fundraising, legal work that must happen, of course, staff costs within the teams that are designing this, sub-consultancies, consultancies. When we are looking at the applications of how they must be submitted, they must be submitted with our templates. Those templates are available on our website. They are specific to each window and specific to feasibility study or proof of concept applications. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at the grant application process, and this funnel gives you a really general idea of what the process looks like. When we, as a starting point, when we're initially having conversations with applicants, we ask that you all submit a design funding questionnaire. This questionnaire is very basic. It's a 5-minute process, shouldn't take long at all to be completed. And it's really meant to give us some very basic information before we jump on a call with you and have the initial conversations. And those initial conversations would be to ensure alignment to the window, answer any questions that you may have that may have come up. Maybe you're looking at the website, have a question. These initial conversations are where you have a chance to ask us that, and for us to also communicate the alignment and eligibility for your initiatives. It's meant to reduce the amount of work also on both your end and our ends on applications that maybe are not eligible or maybe pointing you in the right direction. So again, encourage everyone to take advantage of these communications. The questionnaire initial conversations to be scheduled with the Convergence team. We, importantly, before a final submission, do have the opportunity to provide feedback on draft proposals. This is written feedback, specific, meant to clarify any maybe questions, things we didn't understand within the proposal, asking you to provide more information, asking you to provide clarity, maybe a specific question about your specific concept initiative. So it's a great opportunity to get feedback and refine that proposal before the final submission. We do ask that draft proposals are submitted 2 weeks, ideally more, before that deadline. That deadline, we'll get to it, but it's February 11th and February 18th. And so we are getting to that point of the 2 weeks, and would encourage everyone who is interested in draft proposals to do so as soon as possible. That would then take us to the final proposal. So the final proposals, once submitted, go through a tiered review process on the Convergence end. This tiered review process is then meant for us to shortlist and select a subset of the applications that have been submitted, and then take those shortlisted, proposals through the due diligence process. So our due diligence process involves conversations with the applicants, of course, involves conversation with stakeholders, desk research, much deeper dive into the proposal beyond what the initial documentation that was provided includes, what the initial proposal is. It's really meant as an opportunity for us to really understand what you are proposing in depth prior to a recommendation to a funding committee. So importantly, our funding committee is comprised of independent experts. These independent experts review recommended proposals and we would have discussions with them, and that happens for each cycle. And again, the cycles are on a rolling basis. Once proposals are submitted and discussed with funding committee, if they are approved, then we would go through our final process, which is getting board approval. This board approval is really the fiduciary side of what needs to happen, which would then allow us to go through with a grant agreement and disbursement. Point here in terms of timelines, we would expect from submission of the final proposal or the deadline of the cycle through to a signed grant agreement to be around 3 months for the full process. So for example, for the windows that we're looking at February, we'd be looking at sometime in May to be dispersing an initial tranche of funding. The funding is tranched based on milestones and deliverables for that depend and are specific to each proposal. With that, can we go to the next slide, please? So we're now speaking about the specific windows that are available. So the Indo-Pacific design funding window is focused on sustainable and resilient infrastructure and/or gender equality. Again, just point on clarification here, gender equality does not need to be sustainable or resilient infrastructure focused. Gender equality is sector agnostic. It can be financial services, it can be agriculture, it can be health, education. So for gender equality, again, we're looking at accepting proposals across sectors. The target geographies for the Indo-Pacific window are specifically listed here. These are what the eligible countries are. If there are, let's say it's a broadly regional vehicle, we would be looking at an 80% threshold of exposure to these target countries for you to be eligible for an application. When we're discussing grant types and amounts, we've again discussed feasibility study, proof of concept, or we've described applies in this case. And the next deadline is the 18th of February of 2021. The next one would likely be in August of this year. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the Asia Natural Capital Design Funding Window, this one funded by the RS Group, targets natural capital, as the name suggests, across Asia. We are looking at nature-based solutions, conservation finance. Examples are listed here. The core here is an investment opportunity that has tangible and direct positive impact on natural ecosystems. Of course, that is can encompass a number of different sectors, types of opportunities. That's the goal, and here we are, including some examples to add some color to that. We can also, we'll get to that, but our grant portfolio can also give a sense. The target geography, again, broadly Asia, and feasibility study and proof of concept funding activities apply. And we have a rolling application every 3 to 4 months. The next deadline is coming up soon, the 11th of February, and then we'll have early June as the next deadline. Can we go to the next slide, please? This gives you a snapshot of the grant portfolio. Of note, out of these 21 solutions supported, 3 are from the new windows. More to be added soon. The additional ones, the remaining ones, are from our original design funding window, which was sector agnostic and region agnostic. That is why you would see regions across, beyond Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, as well as the sectoral SDG focus. The full grant portfolio, and we can go to the next slide again, please. The full grant portfolio is available on our website. We would encourage you to go take a look at that, just navigate very interesting and good initiatives.
Thank you everyone so much for joining today. Please do reach out to us at design.funding@convergence.finance if you have additional questions that come up. And this is not a blind inbox. You will be talking to the team who is answering the questions here today, and we look forward to hearing from all of you.